We got one more guest, one more segment here for this Wednesday edition of the program. That is Wes Reynolds, at Wes Reynolds, and the number 1 on Twitter, regular contributor to VSIN and the Point Spread Weekly newsletter. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Going well, Adam. How about yourself, sir?
Doing very well, buddy. Appreciate your time as always here, sir. And you know what? I've told our listeners that we're going to do this, and we're going to do this every Wednesday on our segments with Wes here, at least through the national championship game. That is talk some XFL. We've got week 2 here coming up, but obviously before we get to week 2, we got to take a look back at what happened in week 1. And Wes, I think the biggest story from week 1 is that a lot of these totals got whacked up in the betting market, and the games were lower scoring than we expected.
Yeah, they did. In terms of the openers, which were done at Circa Sports, they kind of functioned, I guess, as the ex-officio guinea pig in terms of making these numbers. And to be fair, you didn't really have much to go on, being that there were no preseason games. There were a couple of controlled scrimmages that the teams did in Houston a few weeks ago, but no real data to go on. So what ended up happening is you had 2 of the 4 games, both the Saturday games, went over the opening total and then went under what ended up being the closing total. So closing totals went 3-1 to the under. And I think it's a combination of a couple things. The league wants more scoring because of the rules that they have. It is always a running clock, but it is a 25-second play clock. So you're not bleeding a lot of clock necessarily in between plays. The ball is spotted usually pretty quickly. There's certain smaller nuances in the rules in terms of you only need 1 foot in bounds for a catch, just like the college rule. You also have what is called in the final 2 minutes of each half, they call it the comeback period, where play stops after each play is completed. Almost like if it's a first down in college football, but it really doesn't matter. Even if you lose yards, they stop the clock to spot the ball, and then once the ball is spotted, then the clock can proceed. So the clock stops pretty much after every play in the final 2 minutes. So they want that. That's a way I think to potentially manufacture scoring. They do not have extra point kicks either. They have where you can go for the conversion after the touchdown, but they do it on basis of where you go from the yard line. So a traditional 1 point extra point would be running an offensive play from the 2-yard line. If you want to go from 2, it's the 5-yard line. And if you want to go for a 3-point play, you do it from the 10-yard line. So that's a way maybe to add some scoring, and also in terms of just a couple different things, in the fact that the field position they want to make better, because what they do with the kickoffs is they basically line the kick gunner unit, it's not really gunners in this spot because they're stationary, and the kick return unit, and they let the kicker kick the ball, and the only people that can move necessarily until the receiver, the return man, catches the ball are the kicker and the return man. And then once the ball has been received by the return man, then you can go forward to your setting up a return or busting the wedge, whatever term you want to call it. And that's how they do it, I think, for kick returns, because they don't want these touchbacks necessarily. They want kick returns to be a part of the game. So that's what they're trying to do. I think eventually the scoring's going to go up and it'll get better as these guys get more used to the rules and whatnot, but also as the teams get used to each other, because these are brand new teams. This is not like an average NFL roster where even if you have a high amount of turnover on a 53-man roster, you've still got high 30s, low 40s in terms of players coming back. So there's some cohesion. So they know each other a little bit and have played together longer. And this is a brand new spot for these teams. And plus, to put your offensive systems into play, it takes a little bit of time, just with the timing issue in terms of receivers and quarterbacks getting their timing out, offensive line getting their protections down. So I do think the scoring is going to exponentially increase, but that might have been something that the market didn't consider, and just taking numbers and then the piggybackers come in and follow suit. That might have been something they didn't take into consideration.
Yeah, and it certainly felt like, there is kind of that feeling out process, whether it's just on a team level or on a league level overall. At Adam Chernoff on Twitter, Adam Chernoff is one of the most brilliant people in this space. Very much respect his work. He ran some of the numbers here, took a look. 124 plays per game in week one. The expectation was that this would be faster than the NFL in terms of plays per game. That wasn't necessarily the case. Just under 5 yards per play, 4.98. But as you go through and look at the box scores here over at XFL.com, the Seattle Dragons, 21 of 41 passing. The Defenders, the DC Defenders with Cardale Jones, 16 of 26. And that 62% was actually one of the better completion percentages on a team level league-wide here. You had some teams that were under 50%, like the Tampa Bay Vipers. Matt McGloin for the DC Guardians was 52%. Really, Philip Nelson and Jordan Teamu in the St. Louis and Dallas game, the two best sets of quarterback numbers, there were only 24 points scored in that game. So obviously some timing mechanism issues with the quarterbacks and the wide receivers. And again, that feeling out process. And, we see that in a lot of other sports too, where as the games increase in importance, there's kind of that feeling out process. Things kind of slow down a little bit. For a lot of these guys, this is their first big shot, and the game's kind of played out that way in a little bit of a tentative manner. So we could see things improve here in week 2, but certainly as we get to weeks 3, 4, 5, and so on.
Yeah, and I think it may not be immediate in terms of the numbers that they put up for the totals this week. They put them up higher simply because, look, when you put it at 40.5, and even though 3 ended up going under the closing number, obviously 40.5 was too low, but the closing numbers last week where they got bet up ended up being too high. So, you see a lot of the totals this week in the high 40s is probably where they should be. There's one that's over 50, that being the Houston Roughnecks, who ended up scoring, I think, 37 points last week. Philip Walker, PJ Walker, the former Indianapolis Colt out of Temple, threw 4 touchdowns, and that's a June Jones coach team, so it's more of a run and shoot type of offense. And they were really, I think, the only offense that kind of seemingly fired on all cylinders in week 1. Hence, they have the highest total at 50.5.
Yeah, and as we look too, let's keep in mind, Landry Jones didn't play, Josh Johnson didn't play. Obviously, those are the two most accomplished quarterbacks here in this league. We do have guys like Cardale Jones, Matt McGloin, that, Jones obviously had that 1 year at Ohio State. McGloin's been a backup and, of course, played pretty well at Penn State as well. But, we had some quarterback questions, and that was something I think was really difficult last week. We saw a lot of line moves, obviously, in this high variance environment, but injury information was very, very difficult to come by. Hopefully that gets streamlined a little bit more here going forward.
Yeah, I hope so as well, because you did have 2 quarterbacks that were supposed to be starters, Josh Johnson in L.A., Landry Jones in Dallas. We knew a little bit about the Jones injury. I did not actually know that Johnson wasn't going to play, and it was the backup, and then the game kind of got away from the LA team in the second half. So, finding information, it's going to take a little bit of work, at least early on, to kind of find this injury information, because we don't really yet know a lot about it. If you're looking at something like a Don Best screen, there's nothing really up for injury information. So I'm sure that's going to come out, I guess, later in the week.
So something that's really interesting here as we start looking at some of the games and the spreads and the totals for these here this week. Game 409-410, the New York Guardians take on the DC Defenders. Defenders 6.5-point favorite once again, which I believe is about the range where their line opened last week. Total here, though, is 48. This one is up, obviously, from last week. But you've got New York, who, correct me if I'm wrong, they played on Sunday last week, whereas DC played on Saturday. So we've got our first short week game here, obviously playing Saturday and Sunday throughout the course of the season. Our first short week game, and you've got to think with the newness and the infancy of this league, that could be to the detriment of New York here this week.
Yeah, and I think it's been bad accordingly, because I think the the initial opener, and I keep in mind the initial opener, this is very early in the week. I think at Circus Sports, I believe that they had put out the Defenders -2. This was as of the afternoon of February 9th. And now you're seeing the Defenders as high as -7. So this was put out on Sunday when games were still being played, or just in the immediate aftermath right after the completion of the games. So look, the Guardians were a team that I actually wanted to fade a little bit this week because they got a 20-3 win over Tampa Bay, but they ended up getting outgained by like close to 150 yards. They just basically played fundamental football and kind of let Tampa Bay turn the ball over to them, which they did, and were able to take advantage of it. But now that this line is going up, and if it goes up a little bit more, I might be interested in not fading New York and actually taking New York, because DC, I think the folks have really kind of jumped on that train. If you watched that game last week, they probably had the best atmosphere. People kind of really like this team, of course, because of Cardale Jones, and they're familiar with him from Ohio State. So they were kind of all about this DC team. But the one thing about this league, I think, Adam, is it's going to be even maybe more conducive to live betting because of the fact, like I explained earlier, with all these conversions that you could go for various point increments, there's no real true key numbers, at least at this point, like we see in terms of the NFL or in terms of even perhaps college football, where you're going to get some oddball scores here. I mean, we were watching that Tampa Bay New York game last week, and it's 20-3, and we were mentioning, theoretically, this is still a 2-score game, even though you're down 17 points, because you can get a touchdown and go for a 3-point conversion. So as absurd as that sounded, it was actually mathematically true. And then I think of that, because of these different conversions that you could go for and these different type of scores you're going to get, the algorithms are completely different in terms of not having necessarily those key numbers that you would have in the other leagues.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And again, I mean, there's such a feeling out process here just in general with this league. And again, with the scoring format, what that means, of course, to, what's going to fall as a key number, maybe when live betting starts to really kind of take hold with this. And they are embracing betting, so kudos to them for that. But, the Guardians, like you said, I mean, it makes sense to see this line go up, from -2 to as high as -7, because how often do you see a team win a game by 20 and have 1 third down conversion in 10 attempts? So, it does seem like there's probably some regression to the mean coming here for the Guardians, as crazy as that sounds, since we don't really have a mean yet with any of these teams here in this league. But, again, like you said, I mean, a team that gets outgained that badly, probably sort of expect them to kind of come back to earth a little bit.
Yeah, you absolutely would. So I think if you want to take the Guardians, maybe wait in terms of an in-game price and see if the Defenders jump out early. I hate necessarily laying it with the Defenders because it's already moved. Whether it was a good opener or not, it's already moved 5 points. So, I mean, I would be waiting maybe to take the Guardians in-game in the spot.
All right, so the other game on Saturday here, the Tampa Bay Vipers take on the Seattle Dragons. Vipers a 3-point favorite in this one, total of 45. It's the lowest total on the board here for this week's set of games. The Dragons return home after losing to the Defenders. The Vipers thought to be a very good team, thought to maybe have a little bit of a leg up on some of these teams here, in particular with Mark Trestman and some of the skill position guys that they had. They gained almost 400 yards, but only scored 3 points. Now they make that long trip here up to Seattle. And again, this one on a short week with that Sunday to Saturday turnaround.
Yeah, two teams with some quarterback questions here. On the Tampa Bay side, Aaron Murray did not play well. He forced a lot of bad throws when they were in scoring position, got a couple picked off, and really left a lot of points on the board. Tampa Bay also, they ended up using 2 quarterbacks, kind of platooned them a little bit back and forth in the second half. Tampa Bay has quarterback / running back, and that's how he's listed on the roster, Quentin Flowers, who is the all-time leading passer at South Florida. So we shall see if maybe eventually he takes over. But Aaron Murray was not good in that game on Sunday. And look, I thought Tampa Bay was going to be a better team because Mark Trestman has a lot of coaching experience in a wide variety of areas. He was especially good in the CFL, winning 3 Grey Cups. So this is a guy, but then we kind of saw Chicago Bears Mark Trestman, I guess, last week. Moved the ball, couldn't put any points on the board. On the Seattle side, at the end of the game against the Defenders, and that was the opening game of the weekend last weekend in D.C., Brendan Silvers out of Troy hurt his ankle, late in the game. And not sure really. I've got to check that injury status because they may go with the backup, who is B.J. Daniels, also out of South Florida, if Brandon Silvers can go. 2 teams that didn't look very good, 0-1. So, look, I guess one of them has got to win. I was a little bit higher on the Vipers than I was on Seattle to start the season, so I would lead with them in the spot.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one too, especially because, you sort of wonder here as we get a look at some of these players, how much do they improve and how quickly do they improve? Because, Aaron Murray, look, 231 yards on only 16 completions, but the problem is only 16 completions, the 2 picks, got sacked 3 times. And Tampa Bay, it just, maybe Trestman's offense is a little bit too complicated early on in this process for them. Because again, these teams had the one set of scrimmages and then a handful of practices. And yeah, they put up some yards, they put up some big plays, but also the 5 sacks allowed. And how much of that changes from one week to the next, where maybe Trestman is taking this a little bit too far in terms of the complication of the playbook. Flowers, of course, did run around a little bit. That's another thing here too. Everyone's trying to figure out their base defenses. If Flowers gets to play some more, and he had 5 carries for 34 yards, maybe there's more improvisation to where there are some more big plays for the Vipers. Again, early on here in this process, I know people want to try and take advantage of what looks like a higher variance environment, but I mean, this is going to be tough at the outset for sure.
Yeah, I absolutely think that it is, and even though I'm doing some work on this stuff, I ended up not having to play the first weekend because I wanted to kind of see this before I really jumped in. I think obviously starting this week and then as you go along, there's more opportunities to kind of jump in and maybe a little bit more certainty in terms of what we're going to see.
All right, so we look at the next game here. This is the first one on Sunday between the Dallas Renegades and the Los Angeles Wildcats. Dallas, a 4-point road favorite in this one, total of 48. And, this Dallas team probably thought to be the best team in the league in a lot of people's minds. They didn't really show it there in week 1, losing to the BattleHawks.
And maybe they still end up being, but I thought the main reason that they were the favorite, to be honest with you, going into the season, at least in terms of the futures market, is mainly because of the familiarity with Bob Stoops and Landry Jones. He's arguably the most high-profile coach of the 8 in the XFL. So I thought, okay, that's why they really like this team. And it ended up that they ended up not scoring an offensive touchdown. It's probably the ugliest game, really, of the 4. So check on the injuries. Wait to see who's going to take over. If it's not going to be Philip Nelson, if Landry Jones is ready to go, he's going to be the one to go. They also have Eric Dungy, who people might remember from playing at Syracuse. So that's on the Dallas side. In the LA side, trying to see if Josh Johnson will be back. I thought Charles Knopf played okay at times for LA, but certainly, what wasn't great, wasn't awful, but I don't know really what to do in terms of a bet for this game. The lean would be to LA here because I want to see the quarterbacks, and plus LA actually they were so bad, I guess, on defense that they let go of Pepper Johnson the day after the game, after the first week, as their defensive coordinator. So the one tricky thing about this game is you're definitely going to have to look for the injury updates. Certainly not as easy necessarily to find information as it would be for the NFL.
Yeah, the injury situation is definitely going to play a huge role in this game. Obviously, the biggest role of any game here this week, because you do have a scenario in which both quarterbacks could be out. But I will say this, a lot of people, I think the common thought process here, and we'll talk about the BattleHawks a little bit more in a couple of minutes, was that St. Louis was probably the worst of the 8 teams here in this league in a lot of people's minds. Say what you will about Dallas's offense and, of course, not having Landry Jones, but their defense also gave up 374 yards in that game, 5.3 yards per play. They had a hard time getting off the field. That seems almost as worrisome to me as not having Jones.
Yeah. And St. Louis was, I think, put low. If you look at who the coach is, Jonathan Hayes, former NFL tight end. This was a guy that was essentially the tight ends coach for Marvin Lewis in Cincinnati for the Bengals for most of Marvin Lewis's run. But then when I looked at Jonathan Hayes, I was like, well, what? He never really got a shot as a coordinator or an assistant head coach someplace. So I thought maybe that was a little telling, and I think that's probably why the market believed them to be the lowest rated of the teams. And then the quarterback is Jordan Tamu from Ole Miss, who, look, he never really lit it up at Ole Miss either. I mean, they had a lot of inconsistencies on offense. Maybe there were some coaching issues, but this isn't a guy that actually set the world on fire in the SEC. So, yeah, for this St. Louis game, maybe would be looking at going to the under, quite frankly, because this is the only total over 50. And I think it's because Houston scored 37 in that first week. So I'm not one that's going to be inclined to bet the overs just immediately in week 2. Eventually, I think there's going to be the adjustments where they get the market in the right place, and you probably get these totals in the mid 40s, and then you'll see them go over as more teams get accustomed to the rules and obviously their offensive systems and schemes that they're running. So if I were to play this game, I can't get there with the BattleHawks as an underdog. And then I think Houston could be, that's recency bias, where they could be a little bit overpriced in a league that I still think to this point has a lot of parity. I don't think you want to make too many snap judgments in week 1. So I don't think that there's that much of a discrepancy, at least through 1 week, that you can say there's a lot of discrepancy there, a lot of difference between 1 through 8. I don't think that there exists that to this point. So if I'm going with the bet in that St. Louis-Houston game, I'd go to the under 50.5.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really interesting, too, to see a little bit more from this Houston defense because, they only allowed 3.9 yards per play in that game last week to the Wildcats, and they were nursing a decent lead for the most part, too. I mean, Nelson Spruce was really the only guy that did anything against them with 11 grabs for 103 yards. What is St. Louis able to do here? Because the thing about St. Louis, because of Te'amu and because of his legs, they were probably the most balanced offensive team in the league last week. A high completion percentage, a high efficiency offensive output for them, running the ball and throwing the ball. Now you kind of wonder if they're able to follow that through here this week and also see, what sorts of adjustments all of these teams make. So again, early on in the process, I know it's football. I know we all want to get excited about it, but again, there will be some of that give and take. There will be a lot of adjustments made, obviously. And I think we just need to get some more data points before we really dive in.
Yeah, I do too. This is still very early, so it's a highly speculative market at this point.
All right, so just in the interest of time here, I want to make sure we get enough time to talk about the Genesis Invitational. So we'll talk some more Big Ten basketball with you next week. And also, I kind of don't mind not talking about what happened with Michigan State last night since I was on the Spartans. So instead of that, we'll talk about golf here. We'll talk about this Genesis Invitational, which used to be the Genesis Open, used to be the Los Angeles Open, and about 35 other different names. But now it's an invitational status tournament, which means smaller field, bigger purse, and really good field.
Yeah, 120 players this week at the Genesis Invitational, including 9 of the top 10 in the world, 30 of the 50 in terms of the official world golf rankings. And like you said, this has just gained invitational status. Tiger Woods is now going to be the ex officio tournament host. Tiger Woods Foundation is the organizer and the philanthropic organization that benefits and also puts on the event. If you remember, Tiger had that tournament. They had that tournament in D.C. called the National, or in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area. That has went away as the Quicken Loan sponsorship went to the event in Detroit, now called the Rocket Mortgage Classic. So, yeah, this is an invitational, which is very similar to a couple other events on tour. Bay Hill, the Arnold Palmer Invitational down in Orlando, Jack Nicklaus's Memorial Tournament, the Old Colonial that's now called the Charles Schwab Challenge, and also the RBC Heritage in Hilton Head. So what this basically means is if you win one of these invitational events, usually for a regular tour event, if you win, like Nick Taylor did last week at Pebble Beach, you get a 2-year exemption. Now you get a 3-year exemption here for winning this event. So really big field at the top. You got a WGC in Mexico next week, so that probably benefits this event, because most of these players are going to be more apt to come over here and play in an event. And being that it's a traditional event that's been around for a long time, it's in Los Angeles. So yeah, very top heavy field this week.
So with that in mind here, I mean, obviously we've got a lot of course data for this event, and even though this is the first year of this thing as an invitational status, a lot of these guys do play this event annually anyway. They certainly like playing at Riviera. Being in the LA area is not a bad thing for a lot of these guys. So we've got a lot of data points for these players. With that in mind, what sorts of guys are you looking to take here this week?
Yeah, this usually you would think, because it's not a very long course, about 7,300 yards. It's more of a strategic course with a lot of dog legs, so you're going to get a fair amount of blind approach shots. So usually you would by default say, oh, this is a ball strikers type paradise. But in recent years, and I don't think you have to be one of these guys to win, but in recent years, you've seen bombers do very well here. Dustin Johnson, Bubba Watson has won 3 times here, 2014, 2016, and 2018. J.B. Holmes is a guy who can get it out there. He's won here. Phil Mickelson's won a couple times here. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, and in fact, you've seen a fair amount of left-handed players win here, ironically enough, largely because of Bubba and Phil. But greens and regulation are important really every week. They're also important here. These are not very big greens. They're Poa Anwa. You have Kikuyu fairways and rough, which the only other course that you have on tour that has that combination is Torrey Pines in San Diego, where they played 3 weeks ago.
All right, so with that in mind, are you looking at bombers? Are you looking at putters? Are you looking at ball strikers? Who's on your list this week?
I went with a little bit of a mix here, and I didn't necessarily go with the top guys, of which you can make arguments for everybody. I ended up keeping Bubba Watson off, even though I think he's obviously a very good form guy here. I just thought the price was too low. I mean, you're seeing Bubba Watson at some places at 20-1, and it's like, when do you see Bubba Watson necessarily the same prices as Xander Schauffele or a Patrick Cantlay or somebody like that? So I thought that was a little bit of an overreaction. So I left him off and skirted him. It might be to my peril, because he's won the last 3 even numbered years. So if he continues that pattern, this would be the year to do it. But I went with Patrick Cantlay. He was my shortest guy at 20-1. UCLA Bruin, so he's played this course a lot in terms of his college golf. He was 4th here a couple years ago. Went also with Tony Finau at 30-1. We know that Finau had that tournament in Scottsdale, won a couple weeks ago, and then Webb Simpson makes 2 birdies on the 2 last holes and ended up beating him in a playoff. So that's kind of the book on Finau. The tee to green profile and a lot of the metrics are there, but he just hasn't been able to close the deal. But he's actually priced shorter here at 30-1 instead of like 33 or 35 like he was in Phoenix a couple weeks ago. He's priced shorter in terms of, and it gets a much better field. So maybe the market's given us a tell there. I don't know, but I went with him. Mark Leishman at 50-1. This is a guy that's beaten the best field on tour this year at Torrey Pines 3 weeks ago. And he's still priced, I think, pretty high in the market in terms of being 50-1 or so. Guy with a couple top fives here. He's somebody I liked. Colin Morikawa. And I played a couple more young guys here than I usually would, because usually they're veterans that win this type of event, and course experience matters. But I went with Morikawa at 55-1. Just the ball striking is really good. He's an LA native, so he's an LA kid. And him and another guy, I bet, Joaquin Neiman, they don't necessarily have experience in terms of the Genesis Invitational, the event, but they both played here back at the U.S. Amateur in 2017, and both of them were in the top 10 in the stroke play event, where they now do a stroke play, and then they seed you in kind of that knockout match play bracket thing for the U.S. Amateur. So they've both played here before. Cameron Champ's a little bit of a bomb at 125, a guy that really is a bomber. Ended up not finishing great last week because he ended up shooting 79 on Sunday, 7 over par at Pebble Beach. But the Pebble Beach got a lot of guys, including Dustin Johnson on Sunday, because the wind really started to pick up. So that's why you saw a lot of guys dip up and down the leaderboard.
Well, I definitely like that list. We mentioned Leishman on yesterday's show with Brian Blessing. That was one of the names that I threw out there. I know you like to play that local angle, too, with a guy like Morikawa. And, especially because those are guys that have a lot of experience here with these courses. And that's never a bad thing to consider here early on, especially during the California swing. Wes Reynolds, you can hear his work on VSIN. Also see him in the Point Spread Weekly newsletter, and follow him on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Wes, when are you going to be on this week?
All over the place, really, man. Just because some of the days have switched around a little bit as we've added some new programming. But we'll be on Friday night from 6 to 10 Pacific. And then over the weekend, you can go to vsin.com and find the details of where you can find our XFL Betcast, at which I will be on the early game in terms of both Saturday and Sunday. And then Monday, the usual slot, 6 to 10 p.m. Pacific time on the Green Zone with Brady Cannon. Our golf show is debuted now. It's going to be every Tuesday night, 5 Pacific, 8 Eastern on VSIN, called Long Shots, where we do an hour show and look at the scene around golf, mainly PGA Tour focus. But as we get more like LPGA or Champions Majors and maybe get some bigger European Tour events, we'll certainly discuss those. So all over the place, man.
Definitely looking forward to all of that. Once again, make sure you follow Wes on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Wes, a pleasure as always, man. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll talk to you again next week.
You got it, Adam. Thanks for having me as always.